Welcome to another More Than Walking video podcast discussion, where we seek to encourage dialogue on a variety of topics with the unique perspectives of people with spinal cord injuries and other disabilities. It is our goal for these conversations to make us think critically and for us to all leave with a newfound sense of belonging in a world where we have more things in common than we do different. Tonight's topic is spinal cord injury, SCI, versus supply chain issues, another form of SCI. And are you feasting or are you famished? I'm your host, Corey Feasley, inspiring artist here in the great state of Connecticut. So amazingly, globalization allows a manufacturer in New York to provide a potable drinking water filtration system to a village in a remote portion of Africa. Yet this vast network of supply chain connections can also mean unpredictable market fluctuation, the rising cost of inflation, and sudden changes that affect everyone's bottom line. During financial downtimes, you can almost hear the wise words of a parent saying, "Have you saved for a rainy day?" Regardless of our many ties to one another, when it comes to the availability of goods, many groups are excluded from the conversation. In the disability community, sustainable resources are needs, not wants. A simple interruption in our daily activities can lead to an unrecoverable deficit. So tell me, what season are you in? Before we get into this video discussion, just want everyone to take the time out, introduce yourself, state your name, state where you're coming in and calling in from. And John, I'll let you take it away.
John or Jonathan?
Oh, you know what? I forgot there's two Johns on the call. We'll go with you, John. John Schitzel.
It's good to have two Johns in most meetings because then there's no lines waiting outside the restroom.
I knew you going there.
My name is John Schutzel, and Jonathan Sigworth woke me up and called my attention to the significant issues of spinal cord injuries and other disabilities as well. Some, Jonathan, maybe 6 years ago.
Yeah, something like that.
Time flies, particularly during COVID, and so I have been learning and listening to Jonathan and Jessica and the folks at More Than Walking, and trying to be helpful and trying to understand things better from a broader perspective. Just as a side note, because I'm going to bring it up later, I sit on a number of boards and was in a conversation yesterday for 3 hours with people pretty much around the world. And we were talking about how the pandemic and and climate change that underlies the supply chain issues and the war in Ukraine affects the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere differently. The Northern Hemisphere, it's an inconvenience, a problem, an expense. Southern Hemisphere, it's sadly a death sentence in many cases. And I think we've got to look at that range of differences in how these problems affect different people in different circumstances. And Corey, you are so right. You know, what is an inconvenience for some is an incredible day-destroying challenge for others. And so I want to learn about that and figure out if there's any way I can be helpful.
Awesome, thank you. Tahira, tell us about where you come and calling in from.
My name is Tahira Johnson, and I am calling in from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma.
Awesome.
Hey, I'm Sandy. I'm from Florida, South Florida, Sunrise. I got into a car accident about 7 years ago that broke my C4, C5 area. I'm only mobile about the shoulders up. However, life keeps going. I have a 16-year-old son that keeps me on my toes. And I go to school full time to finish my psychology degree. And hopefully one day I'll be able to advocate more for disabled people by doing podcasts like this and sharing my story and motivational speaking.
Awesome.
And hey, I'm Jonathan, C7 complete, injured in India back in 2006, and also hailing from Connecticut.
Is Erin still here?
Yeah, I was just gonna, yeah.
Oh, you're messing with me.
Erin Taylor, she, her pronouns. I live in Portland, Oregon, but I work for a nonprofit in New York for people with mobility disabilities. So I myself am not a wheelchair user, but I identify as having non-apparent disabilities and also part of the LGBTQ community. So that's where my intersectional identity comes in. And I just got my master's in disability studies too. So I work with a tech access initiative on talking about how mobility disabilities voices need to be heard in the tech space and how we can elevate a lived experience to have the tech companies realize that. So I heard about you, Corey Lee, from a friend, and he's like, you should check this out. So, and anytime I hear about the pandemic, that's been a lot of my schoolwork has been the pandemic and how we don't want to go back to normal. That's what we keep hearing, and normal did not work. So why are we so quick to go back there? So anytime we can talk about the pandemic, I'm in, because it's not over, even though people seem to think it is. So anyway, thank you for allowing me to be here tonight.
No problem. Thank you for joining us.
And can I add a couple things now that I see people are talking more about themselves? I was injured 15 years ago playing roller derby in Chicago. I'm C4, C5 incomplete. And what else? Oh yeah, I like the idea of that, normal sucks, or going back to normalcy sucks. So that's cool. I'll remember that. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for those introductions and just sharing a little bit about yourself, because that's what's important in this, as Erin talked about, a shared experience that we are all involved in, whether we want to acknowledge it, whether we want to say that it's actually happening, because oftentimes, we've seen over the course of the last 3 years, from the pandemic to climate change, some people want to deny it, some people don't want to acknowledge it, but it's going on all around us. You can take a look at what's happening down in Jackson, Mississippi, where people are in need of water, and you're surrounded by water that you cannot drink, nor do you have any type of access to. So yes, some people may feel like one catastrophe or one global event is over. For others, it's another global event that's occurring. And all we're trying to do is provide our perspective, because all in all, it affects everyone differently. And sometimes, more so oftentimes, it disproportionately affects one population group more so than another. And we're just trying to find some plausible solutions to real life problems, because we're all living through all of those issues and those situations. So that brings us to question one. And, we're just going to kind of go back in time to the beginning when, yes, everybody heard of SARS, and you kind of knew what COVID kind of was, but you didn't really recognize it for the severity that it caused. So, since the pandemic wreaked havoc around the globe, this has led to major supply chain disruptions. In the beginning, it was laughable that people were fighting over pallets of water and toilet tissue. I don't know how many of you guys were frustrated if you didn't have enough TP for your bunghole, per se. The need for desired resources became even more of an issue when you couldn't purchase, let alone find hand sanitizer, bleach, and disinfectant wipes. We were all trying to figure out how to combat the spread of COVID. As the saying goes, desperate times calls for desperate measure. So my question to you guys is, what did you do during the course of the pandemic to help you stretch your resources? And to hear, I would love to know, what did you do at the onset of COVID?
I did not have too many issues. I get my supplies through Medicaid, low income, insurance here in Oklahoma. And I did not have too many problems. I do order groceries through Instacart. I've been doing that for about 3 years. So at one point, you couldn't get groceries the next day. It would be 3 days. And it was just somebody came over. He was a young guy. And I said, oh, it took 3 days. I said, how is it? He said, oh, it's a madhouse over there. So I guess it was just a lot of people started ordering online. But otherwise, I can't even think of anything else I had an issue with. I think my supplies came through fine. And I guess my assistants made sure that I had just hand sanitizer and stuff. They'd get some for me too. So I guess I was fortunate that not too much changed for me personally.
Yeah, me too. Not too much.
Sorry, hold on. Not to cut you off, Sandy. I want you to kind of follow up with this question as you're answering it. But you started saying that you were ordering, but then it started the gaps and the increase in days occurred. Did you find that to be like maybe a little bit of a cause for concern?
I wasn't too concerned. I had enough food in the house. It was just a matter of maybe not having some staples for a couple of days, but nothing I couldn't live without. And that actually too made me kind of look in the pantry and in the freezer. It's like, okay, there's plenty of food in the house. It's just stuff I don't normally look for, but I have plenty of food. So it was not a big deal. I don't remember how long that lasted until it normalized again, but I wasn't too concerned. I tend to roll with the punches though. So, but that's the only thing I can think of was like Instacart initially. Yeah, I don't think I really had other problems with supplies.
Okay. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, I had almost the same experience. I didn't necessarily go without during the pandemic outside of, like she said, delayed deliveries and stuff like that. And because a lot of certain things like wipes, sometimes we don't have enough wipes or I always try to buy everything in bulk. So I tend to have a lot of things that I don't usually use. So when things like that, when delayed deliveries come, I always have extra. So outside of that, and plus during the pandemic, I mostly lived alone. I now don't live alone, and my resources get used faster because of the people that live in the house. But outside of that, when I was living alone, mostly everything was still there and I didn't have to worry about anything too much. But I know everybody else though, a lot of other people were feeling the effects of the pandemic as far as their resources. I know when people said that they would go into the grocery store, all of the everything was always depleted. But for the most part, if you order online, you usually get it even if it's late.
Yeah, no, it's true. I can still remember going into the grocery store, and I remember they were restocking the shelves, and in real time, you could hear people yell out, "Hey, they're bringing out the paper towels!" And then people were like, it was like, I don't know, there was a show like Mall Madness back in the 90s or something like that, where like people had to like run around like the grocery store and stuff and pick up items that were picked on the scoreboard and race to the aisle. I've never seen like shopping cart, go-kart kind of racing in my life. So you're absolutely right. Those things happen. I want to speak to Erin about it. Like, how was it like for you during the course of the pandemic?
Well, I think it was, interesting on several levels, but with being immunocompromised, it wasn't as safe for me to go outside. And we had never really done online shopping. And so that was kind of a new venture for us because we'd always gone into the store. And so now trying to figure out how to do online shopping and stuff was new for us. So really that like helped accessibility for a lot of people, right? And that was a really good aspect that we saw. For us, it was the same thing. Like you couldn't, like toilet paper sometimes would be behind counters and you could have 2 packs of it and people would have to hand it to you to have it approved to like buy it. And so it was interesting to see, and you go in, like the couple of times I did go in and the shelves were just empty. So it was such a strange experience I don't remember, except like you said, Cabbage Patch dolls, right? When that big like thing happened and everybody took all the Cabbage Patch dolls off the shelves and stuff. I don't remember things being like that. So for me, it was almost like a apocalyptic event, like where everything's just taken out of the store. It was a really interesting experience. For us, it was a little bit different too, because my partner works in patient rehab. And so people who had acquired injuries and were leaving to go home after, leaving rehab, you weren't able to do a lot of the in-person things with family members and stuff. So it was making sure that we had supplies that we could get to people that maybe did not have, the services and the products that they needed. So making sure to keep those on hand that we could get from other people to be able to get resources to people where they were needed. So it was, that's kind of like on the West Coast, what we experienced.
Was there any level of apprehension, like that fear of knowing that, okay, you have this widespreading disease that is going around and is claiming people's lives and being immunocompromised? Did it feel like maybe their supplies may not get to me, especially with the experience of online shopping, because that was like a bit of an issue too. Like there's a lot of congestion because people are ordering so much. And then that drove inflation because there was a high demand cost, like, what you would typically get, disinfectant wipes for, a pack of 4, maybe $30 is like double now. Did you ever feel like any apprehension during your partner?
Yeah, I would say probably yes, completely, because of going out in public, right? So if you can get a hold of masks, if you can get a hold of antibacterial, like hand sanitizer and stuff, but that you needed that to go out into public to feel safe, especially like pre-vaccination and boosters, having that, there was a lot of apprehension. So I felt like all of a sudden where for me, like where I was able to go out whenever I wanted to, all of a sudden, like there was a safety was taken away, if that makes any sense. So.
No, that makes perfect sense. Like, I think our sense of security was definitely removed because, being able to go in and out of a grocery store and find supplies that you need is just like, it's light work. You don't even think twice about it. It's like, oh, I need to go get cereal's there, or I need to go get some bleach or whatever because I'm doing clothes. Those things are just readily available, but then all of a sudden, like poof in a blink of an eye. And I can understand that, especially us in the disability community where we're constantly disinfecting and we're trying to, minimize the bacteria that we may come in counter with. But that makes perfect sense about anxiety. So Jonathan, how was it for you during the course of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember it exactly, but I think as soon as everything started to go south, I ordered like a 90-day supply of my medical stuff, which was good. I always have extra medical supplies anyway because my monthly order is redundant, like it's double what I actually need. So I have a closet full of stuff. But that's not the case for alcohol, which I used to sterilize when I cath in order to use the bathroom. So that became an issue rather quickly. So I had to adapt and use anodyne or benzoyl peroxide and figure out other ways of doing that. And then I didn't know about Instacart until like 3 months ago. So but Peapod saved us. My wife is also a healthcare worker. She's a physical therapist. So that sense of like, oh my gosh, we're going to bring COVID home. What are we going to do? That was terrifying, especially when, they started, shifting personnel around. So like physical therapists were now going into the hospital helping COVID patients. And you couldn't use, my spouse is immunocompromised as an excuse. So we were really lucky that didn't happen. But that was so stressful.
So like, you bring, not to cut you off, you bring up a good point. Like, I think Aaron's at a partners in healthcare, your wife is in healthcare. What was that balance like between like when she's coming home, is it like, babe, leave the scrubs at the door, shower first before you come see me? Like, what was kind of like your own system of quarantining within the quarantine?
Yeah, we were still in an apartment in downtown Bridgeport at that time, and we had an extra room. So, if either of us started showing symptoms, we would lock ourselves away there. I think that only happened once, but everything was fine. But yeah, I mean, it's straight to the shower when you get home. But I mean, it's also just because all the information was so fluid. You could be infected and not even know it. It was just this constant anxiety and almost like dread because you feel guilty or potentially guilty of like exposing your partner, and that was really tough.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I can't imagine what that's like, and I'm thankful for people whose spouses work in that field because they, that's heroic. Because just because this disease, this virus is going around doesn't mean that other people still don't need that type of aid, the physical therapy, the occupational therapy, people's mental health, which was like super challenged throughout all of this because it increased, I think, a lot of people's fears and anxiety because you just didn't know what to trust, who to trust. And, that swath of information that was coming in constantly, whether you're watching the news, whether you're listening to radio, you're looking up on the internet trying to figure it all out. So, you know, I can't imagine what that was like. Mr. Schitzel, like for you, sir, what was it like? Did you feel any apprehension? How did your household handle COVID?
I got to tell you how impressed I am listening to people who have additional difficulties, additional burdens, responding to this 2-year period with such resilience, responding to it as if it were an inconvenience, but a manageable inconvenience, and managing it. You know, I live in a world that is mostly privileged and mostly enabled, non-restricted. And oh my word, the complaining I heard, we can't deal with this. You know, I am listening to heroes who deal with pre-pandemic and probably post-pandemic everyday difficulties that are far in excess of what other folks have and are dealing with it better than other folks do. I'm just impressed. I am singularly impressed. And just to add a little personal experience on this, I have been, well, as healthy as a 74-year-old can be, you know, and as privileged and as able as a 74-year-old could be. And I just got a recent diagnosis of Parkinson's, and it's not disabling at this point. It's not a big problem at this point. I have flutter finger, which means that touchscreens are a problem, but it has suddenly woken me up to how difficult it could be, it can be, it is for folks who have limitations. I am just so thoroughly impressed. I have a lot to learn from you, and so do folks like me. Thank you.
No problem. And, you know, I say sorry to hear about your diagnosis, while at the same token, just like I think COVID did, it brings out another level of kind of like thankfulness and appreciation. And sometimes hardships do that. And it's similarly to when we started going through this pandemic. I don't know how many of us really were concerned about supply chain issues or infrastructure issues. Sure, you may say, this road is, you know, a little broken down, or that bridge can use some repair. But then when we become subject to a universal threat, it tends to bring out this almost like a second wind out of people. And for us with disabilities, we have a tendency to always come up with some type of contingency plan. So for those of you who are going to listen to this podcast and maybe in the beginning stages of experiencing a disability, know that things like how Jonathan spoke about, he already ordered his stuff like well in advance. That minimizes when you have to deal with like a threat where you could be confined to the housing and you're not able to be as mobile, or you lost a spouse who may have been the one going out to get the items for you. It's a good idea to do things in bulk. And it sounds universal until you actually go through your supplies very quickly. And I know for me, I am a household of 4. It's me, my wife, and I have 2 sons. And, you know, as soon as disinfectant wipes were going, we were like, all right, well, we go to BJ's anyway. So we have like 8 of them. But then I think one of the issues that affected many people that, you know, hopefully we'll touch a little bit on if we have the time, is just the inflation aspect of it, right? So sometimes we were looking at things like, okay, 2 bottles of disinfectant wipes, $60. How many people can spend $60 on 2 bottles of disinfectant wipes? So
inflation or price gouging?
Well, a little bit of both, because I don't know if you guys remember the case of that gentleman who bought, I think, almost $20,000 worth of disinfectant, like hand sanitizer. And his goal was to resell it and try to make double his money. And then they viewed it as a crime, made him disperse it for free. You know what I mean? So, you know, sometimes, you know, we reap what we sow, which is unfortunate in events like that. And that brings me to another question, and to hear, maybe you can talk about it if you experienced it. Did you guys find that people try to take advantage of you personally at all?
No, I'm wondering, like, hearing Jonathan speak, I found it interesting about being worried about, like maybe bringing COVID home, maybe. You know, that didn't even occur to me, but see, I'm kind of like, I may be a bit cavalier because I did have my assistant was also taking some shifts at a nursing home. So maybe I should have been concerned, but you know, I'm like, the way I grew up, like as a kid, we were homeless for a while in San Francisco. And I think crises are almost kind of my, you know, I'm at home in them, unfortunately. But it just didn't faze me at all. I mean, I didn't like the fact that I go to the Unitarian church and we didn't have church for over 2 years. And we went on, you could go on YouTube, you know, online, but, you know, it wasn't the same. But as far as like, no, I was not anxious. No, it didn't bother me. But the idea of having to go without or something doesn't really disturb me unless I really thought that I would be going hungry and there was just no food or something extreme like that. But otherwise, I think, yeah, maybe with our next crisis, I'll try to be less cavalier. I'll keep that in mind because although I do think I had COVID in January and I was a little sick, but it wasn't too bad. You know, I took a couple of days off work, but I was able to make up my hours. But I mean, you never know, you know, could get it next time and be really sick or something. So it's, yeah, I'll try to take it more seriously next time.
Terrified.
Okay.
I was actually still living in a nursing home when the COVID outbreak came out. So I experienced a couple of my roommates passing from COVID and everybody panicking about cleaning procedures and having enough supplies for certain things. It was really crazy. Thank God within 6 months before they started locking all the nursing homes down to family, I was able to get out. But it was COVID still, it scares me because I haven't contracepted it or anything, but I'm not immune to it. So I've seen what it's done to some people in my family. Some people they don't have no symptoms, but then I have a few friends that passed away already from COVID that were young, healthy, didn't seem like they had anything wrong with them. So it was very problematic for me. I'm still stressed out a little bit about it because every so often my case manager will call me and be like, the pandemic is not over. I still have clients that are passing from COVID. Do you have all your supplies? Do you have everything that you need? If I don't have to come to your house, I really don't want to, you know? So.
I'm definitely sorry to hear that. Yeah, I lost some people as well due to COVID. Matter of fact, a friend of mine passed away back in October and he had COVID the year before. And so, you know, we believe it is a heart attack, but it's exacerbated by the fact that he had COVID beforehand, which, you know, it's tough. And, you know, like Tahira said, like, you know, sometimes we approach things with a nonchalant attitude or we look at it and say, maybe it's not going to be as bad until it gets as bad. So it changes our mind and changes our perspectives in a unique way. Unless somebody else has something to add, I just wanted to move on to the next question because, like, you know, I want to get everybody's thoughts and opinions on everything. But just going off of that note, seeing that people have died from this, we know over 500,000 people perished in the United States alone, millions of people across the globe. You know, it really, like Aaron said earlier, is like an apocalyptic event. And, you know, I know for me, like watching the movie 2012, I don't know how many of you have seen that movie, but like, you know, everybody's trying to do their best to prepare for something of this nature. And I think about as we try to prepare, look how many people running into the fire too, like healthcare workers, etc. So my question to you guys, in our world today, who should be able to choose which person receives urgent care first? And are you willing to put aside your needs so that others may be addressed ahead of you? Because that happened often. You saw like, all right, who's going to get the vaccine first? Who's going to be prioritized? Are you sick enough to be on a ventilator? No, you can't come to a hospital. You got to stay home in quarantine. Like, how do you guys view who gets help first versus who doesn't?
Well, is your question who gets it first or who should get it first?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, a little bit of both, because on one hand, everybody's suffering, and how do we create this kind of this line of, all right, you right there, you're sick enough, so then you go first, or you right there have to wait. Who chooses that?
I mean, as an observer, in the large scope of things, I mean, it's the people with money who get to choose. Country-wise, of course, everyone was saying that, the poor countries, more vulnerable countries need to be prioritized. There needs to be even distribution of vaccines. And of course, looking back, we know that absolutely did not happen. And then kind of on a more local thing, there was the issue of, well, if the hospitals are overwhelmed, who gets priority in the triage process? And I believe that's determined by, one, your likelihood to survive, and two, the quality of life that you will have if you do. And so you have situations where you have elements of racism, or you have elements of just ignorance about people with disabilities, and people make assumptions based on your economic background. And if you're a racial minority and with a high level of injury, you don't want to end up in a packed emergency room where everyone assumes that, their quality of life as a high level quadriplegic isn't that good anyway. So that's really scary. But it's also like one of the most frustrating things, kind of thinking about it, is in the world today, like that triage really isn't necessary, right? Like the hospitals did not have to be overwhelmed. Like that wasn't an inevitable result. It was largely because so many people who didn't have disabilities, or who felt like there was an infringement on their rights or whatnot, wouldn't take these public health measures seriously. And there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and that's what really led to this kind of crisis. So I don't think in the world today, with the technology that we have, with the education that we have, that should even be a question. And it's an unfair question, unnecessary question, if we really put our money where our mouth is.
You know what? I think you're on to something, but it also seems to kind of be a little bit of a hypocrisy. Whereas if it's the people with the money or the people with the greatest survivability is the one that we kind of choose as preferable, but at the same token, we're in a culture that preaches we want to take care of the sick and the most vulnerable first. And I read about one way that they kind of balance that out. I think it was like a Norwegian study I read about, where that's what they were looking at. They're looking at, okay, the elderly and those who have disabilities, they are supposed to be the ones that get affected quicker. But I feel like COVID didn't do that, because there were some of the most healthiest people and found themselves the victim of the virus. Aaron, do you agree with John's assessment of like how people are chosen in terms of who gets what first versus another person?
Oh my gosh, this is a topic that we could spend hours on, right? On quality of life and who gets to determine who has a better quality of life. What is quality of life? Who should be able to get it? Who deserves it, right? And oftentimes it is power and privilege that gets that decision, right? And that's not the way it should be. And so we saw time and time again where people's question of quality of life was questioned, when not even to their loved ones, saying like, hey, how do you think? Or asking the person themselves, what's your quality of life like, right? But because of diagnosis or because of symptoms or whatever, people are making these decisions for people that they shouldn't have. So we saw so many cases of, like Jonathan said, for people with disabilities and people of, other marginalized communities, of where they were seen as less than. And historically, that's the way that disabled people and people in other marginalized communities have been seen. And so it was sad, because you think that we would have learned, and yet we saw history repeat itself in so many ways during COVID. When you think in 2020 that we wouldn't still be having these conversations or questioning who deserves life, when you even use a term like, when people use the term like vulnerable population, you're already saying that they are less, they're not as healthy, they're more apt to, right? So that already kind of sets a precedence there. And then when you hear like our CDC director say, well, if people have 4 or more, comorbidities, basically they're already one step closer to death, right? And so even with comments like that and messaging like that, until over 150 disability organizations got together and said, hey, no, this is not the messaging we should hear from the CDC, and they retracted it. Even the messaging from the very top was very much like, who gets to determine that quality of life for a person? And there's so many. I was just talking with somebody about this today, and about the term normal, and how people were question of quality of life. Their quality of life was questioned, and it's just even 3 years later, almost 3 years later, looking back and seeing case after case, story after story, life after life questioned. And so, 1000%, I agree with Jonathan on all those levels. And we shouldn't have to even have somebody ask whose quality of life is more than somebody else's.
I think there's sprinkles of political advantage that is mixed in when we talk about vulnerable population. So for instance, I was reading through President Biden's infrastructure bill and what it covers, and in I would say two places, in dealing with transportation and then like environments, like let's say there's like some type of plant that's next to a neighborhood that's emitting a lot of fossil fuels and what have you, and is next to this neighborhood where it disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, African American. And granted, statistics and numbers don't necessarily lie. And when they talked about transportation, they talked about it'll improve accessibility for the disabled community and what have you. So then sometimes there's like little sprinkles of what politicians are seeking to do in order, I think, sometimes to get their vote, instead of looking at the overall abundance of this issue is just affecting everybody. So there needs to be some type of equal footing when we do assess. Just because a person is in a neighborhood less privileged than another does not necessarily mean that we all should not look at each other as taking precedence. But there has to be some type of rank and file, I think, at some point, because you just can't distribute everything poof in one fell swoop. So I think it's more about learning how to be okay with the order. But like, I want to pivot that question to John, the other John. Being an older person and seeing younger people, did you ever feel like, are the younger people valuing older people as, one of the core driving factors behind COVID, were younger people still engaging in meeting up with one another and spending time? How did you view that at all?
I think there's a difference between age and privilege, because I think there is an instinct for my generation, the grandparent heading for great-grandparent generation, to think better them than me, better them than us. But that is kind of overcome by what Jonathan was talking about, which is the sense of privilege. What I am so amazed by and impressed with is that the folks on this call who have far more difficulty to deal with it and don't complain, and are not complaining, are viewing it as, a difficulty that can be overcome, that can be managed, when so many people who have a much easier life and a much easier way of dealing with these things, complain incredibly about how their needs are not being met. I don't feel deserving of more attention because I am more at risk, or me and my wife are more at risk than others because of our age. I feel that everybody should get that kind of attention. And I think that our advantage has to do with a couple of things. One of them is respect for elders, which is a part of so many cultures. The other is we tend to be in a more privileged setting. And once again, I am so impressed with hearing people who have far more difficulty dealing with these kinds of events talk about managing it. And I hear my friends and my peers complain incredibly about having inconveniences. I don't know if that's helpful. I hope I was answering your question.
No, you did. I mean, it just made me think about like kind of like equal footing is equity for all. Like, being able to say, because what I hear from a lot of older folks in terms of old enough to be my parents, typically what comes from your age group is like, I've lived my life. I've gotten the chance to experience, many things. And so you tend to make room for those younger generations, right, to thrive and to build, because now is their time, because you once were the age. And I can respect that and honor that, because I think it is an honorable thing to say that you don't feel like your life is more important simply because you're in a more vulnerable stage. But oftentimes that's what the pandemic did. It brought out sometimes the ugly in people, even for the people who wanted to try to do the best for themselves, pushing others to the side. Sandy, what's your take, like in terms of when you line things up, and try to draw parallels? Do you see yourself as a person that like, hey, I got to kind of worry about my needs too, because I want to live? And do you even think that like is a selfish notion to want to put your needs in terms of, because you're a person that needs more assistance and more care than others?
Collectively, like when everybody's talking about it in a normal setting like this, it's easy to think a little bit more rationally. However, like if you're put in a specific situation, like not too long ago during the pandemic, I had to go get some blood, and my doctor told me I needed to get it right away, so I had to go to the emergency room. So when I went to the emergency room, they accidentally put me in this COVID room, this room labeled COVID. And for 12 hours, nobody responded to me. I didn't have my phone. My phone happened to be in my purse, but it was far away. At the time, I was panicking because I didn't know. I forgot my phone was there, so nobody was checking in on me. I wasn't sick or anything. I just needed to go get some blood because I'm iron deficient. And so I wasn't getting any assistance. And usually I'm getting, catered to every hour, every 2 hours. Somebody's right next to me, whether I need water or whatever. So when you're in the trenches of this pandemic, it's almost for every man for themselves. Sometimes I felt like I was going to die because, oh, well, she has COVID. She's paralyzed. She can't help herself. Then, so be it. Whoever God sends your way, then hopefully you don't be the ones, to be the one stuck in the room. Because I heard a lot of different cases where, especially when I was in the nursing home, where because of the person's fear of them catching COVID themselves, they wouldn't help those patients. They wouldn't go in their rooms, or, well, you're going to die anyway, or, whatever, like the way some people feel about people who have disabilities. Every life matters at the end of the day. And if you're capable of helping somebody, I believe that because we're social beings and we ultimately need each other to survive, you need to do what you need to do. To say somebody has priority over one other person, like Jonathan says, it shouldn't be a question that we should ask. Every life has its value, whether the perspective of the person doesn't agree with it or not.
No, and you know what? You sparked this thought in my mind. I want to hear to kind of touch on it real quick. So, this idea of no man is above the next, right? It sounds all good and well, right? But like this kind of brought out this, like I said in the first question, desperate time, call for desperate measure. Tahir, can you speak to what was your thought, maybe, if you had a thought about it at all, about individuals who were COVID positive, but still went to work because they had to address their needs because financially they can't pay their rent or they can't pay their car bill and whatnot. What did you have any opinion or any thought about those individuals who maybe felt like their needs needed to be prioritized by still going in regardless of being sick or not?
Well, I guess that's kind of a tough one, especially before vaccines. And now that you mention it, I'm sure it happened where people just didn't feel like they could skip a couple of paychecks because they had COVID. I suppose if you're quite careful, you could be okay. But yeah, I don't know if somebody really can't meet their bills otherwise. It's kind of I don't know how many options there were for someone in that kind of situation. And then we had the rent freezes and things like that for some people, COVID related. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. But I would say also that like vulnerable persons, I don't know, that never bothered me. I kind of think there's something to it, especially for certain disabilities and for people who are maybe over 70 and definitely 80 plus. I mean, that seemed to make the numbers go. I mean, it seemed to make certain people quite vulnerable. I didn't feel that was offensive. I don't know if I'm immunocompromised. I think my doctor said not really. I don't know. I'm pretty sure I asked. I think the answer was like no, basically, but or not really. But yeah. And then as far as it being like 2022, and that doesn't surprise me. I mean, fascism is at an all-time high probably since the 30s or 40s, the 1930s and 40s. So, I mean, people sort of, none of that would faze me. But yeah, I mean, as far as someone subjecting other people to it, I do think that's pretty tricky. So, yeah, I'm not sure about that one.
Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, I would say, that's why you need good, federal nationwide laws that have provisions for requiring employers or requiring the government to provide universal medical leave, so that people aren't forced into these unnecessary and unsafe decisions. Like that is a situation that doesn't need to happen. If people make the collective decision, if our government makes the collective decision that we don't want to force people to go to work for financial concerns if they're sick, like that shouldn't be necessary. It doesn't help any of us. And so, I mean, my thought is that's kind of a wake-up call, and maybe transitions into the third question of, well, yeah, this is what it's like if everyone starts experiencing a disability in the sense of, losing control of where you can go, when you can go, the stakes being life and death for going to the grocery store, everyone becomes immunocompromised in this environment. And if that's a possible situation, what are the collective mechanisms that we can have in place to protect us, to protect all of us, because we are all of a sudden a vulnerable population.
No, that's an excellent point, Aaron. How do you feel like globally? Do you feel like that was a bit of a, do you feel like this was a disabling event?
I personally feel like it was one of the most mass disabling events because we don't even know what the final outcomes are going to be. We don't know what residual, like what it's going to be like 5-10 years from now. Like you said, having a friend who had it and then having a heart issue and dying because of, residual effects of COVID. We don't know how that's going to impact people. So I definitely feel globally that it is definitely a mass disabling event. Whether people identify as having a disability or not, from the after effects, they still many are. And I know people who've had it have been very healthy and have had it a couple times, and now they have heart problem and respiratory problem and never had that before. I've known people like, you don't know who it's going to hit, when, and how. And I think that's what is for me scary about it, because like I could have a very simple case where it's just like mild cold, or have something much more severe, and people don't know. It's hitting everybody so differently. So I think yes, and we still don't know what the final outcome is going to be like for our society as a whole for future.
Oh, and I'm sorry about interrupting. You just made me realize that I do know someone with a similar injury. He's also higher level, and he had COVID, and he has not had, I believe it's a sense of taste since November. So that is one person that I know who's had possibly a permanent change, hopefully not permanent, but yeah, that is the one person I know who, and that's scary to think of not having a sense of taste, and I'm sure that's really, or smell. That's a tough one. So
I totally agree with Erin. I think it was a mass disability, and some of them, like what she said, that she has a non-visible disability. Like there's mental illnesses. People are experiencing so much depression and isolation from this situation. I think not only is it the world experiencing a disability, but we're more aware of how crippling our society has been in so many different sectors, from the medical sector, from our political sector, from our financial systems. The money is not, it's crazy. Like, it feels like a little bit apocalyptic and everything is falling apart. Good thing I have a strong sense of belief in my faith, so I know that everything will fall into its place, even though it looks like it's falling apart. But I know people who are still damaged by this situation. Some people may feel like it's back to normal, but it's not back to normal for some people because they lost their jobs, or their health is compromised, or mentally they don't understand, the whole concept of what, the up and down of what we were going through. It was just such a strong sense of fear that was going on. There was fear mongering so much people with this pandemic. It's crippling.
Very much so. And with all that has gone on, just experiencing an SCI and experiencing COVID, it has put such a huge constraint on, again, our infrastructure, right? You had it to the place where, when you're you're looking for those typical items, and I feel like now more than ever is a time for us to learn from this global experience, this problematic situation, how we can kind of improve on those things, right? So, one of the things I'm taking away a lot from everybody's answers is, something can come eventually in the future, but you're doing the best that you can in the present, in trying to be prepared for whatever may come. You may not necessarily get there, but at least you have some semblance of preparedness, and that you're ready for the next event. And I wanted to get the other John's opinion on it. Did you find COVID and just the supply chain issues to be kind of like a global disability?
Again, I am so impressed with how folks with spinal cord injuries and other disabilities manage the COVID pandemic. But talking about learning from hindsight and history, I find myself thinking that the pandemic was an appetizer, not an appetizer, was a forewarning of what climate change is going to be globally. It is going to be longer lasting. There is no vaccine. There is no quick cure. You can't isolate yourself from it. And what I am finding myself thinking about a great deal is resilience. And I'm hearing resilience in this group that I continue to be so impressed by. I don't know whether that answered your question, but that's what I'm thinking.
No, I hear you. I mean, I think that's what it is. You talk about resilience and just trying to adapt on the fly. I read about a study that Johns Hopkins Medical did back in 2014 as it pertains to just supplies, needing enough, having enough. And again, I just want to stress that when we're in the high times and good times, we're not necessarily concerned about wasteful or extravagant spending, right? Like, all of us can be prodigal at times, and we don't appreciate. We may eat something, we may say, I'm good, I'm not good for leftovers past a certain point in time, and other countries don't have it like that. But just going back to the study with Johns Hopkins, they talked about surgical equipment, right? So, you go into surgery, you open up the sterile equipment, you may use, let's say, 5 gauzes out of 15, at least 10 left. Everything in that kit has to then be thrown away. All of that stuff kind of goes to waste. And of some 232 surgical centers that they did this survey with, they found that at the end of the day, throwing away all the extra portions inside of a kit is about 2 million pounds, which would translate into $15 million a year of just wasteful spending. In terms of, like, when you look at supply, you say, okay, right now we're stuck with not knowing if we're going to get gas prices to go down by a certain time. The winter's coming up, it's going to be expensive and stuff, but just this extravagant wasteful spending that we have a tendency to do. And so John Hopkins partners with a hospitals in Ecuador, and they followed some like 33 patients who got to use some of this medical equipment that they give away, right? And they found that of the 33 people or so, they were given this medical equipment that treated preventive like diseases and sicknesses and whatnot, and it added like 8 years to their lives from a statistical standpoint. So I think what we have to figure out is how can we get lawmakers to see that when we go through traumatic events, to be all inclusive for all populations, not just minorities, LGBTQ, or anybody, but just everyone collectively, because we kind of like have a heartbeat in unison, and just figuring out everybody has demands, but more importantly than trying to reach people's demands, let's try to reach people's needs and at the base, what everybody requires. You know, would you guys say that's kind of like an overall arching analysis of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think that's right on. And, you know, it's this idea that at the same time, we need to insulate ourselves in a certain way. You know, we need to learn how to save more. We need to learn how to plan, prepare for the worst, not see ourselves as individually or nationally or globally kind of invincible to either another pandemic or economic, disruption. As an analogy, the supply chain issues that we're having now are kind of like economic long COVID. And I love John's comment about, this is just a foretaste of what's going to be happening with climate change. But at the same time that we have to kind of build in like this self-protecting insulation thing, it's simultaneously protecting our neighbor. It's protecting others outside of our little bubble so that we can still function collectively, or so we can still help each other. And as part of that, finding those other ways of supporting, as in your John Hopkins example, we need to be collectively resilient and in solidarity, because there's no other way we survive. Like literally the whole world survives out of this. And I've always said, the disabled community, I think, is a real model for this, because the only way that we've gotten disability rights, the only way that we've gotten legislation through, the only way that we've been able to make progress as a community is by coming together out of isolation, finding each other and coming together in that way because of our vulnerabilities, and I think that's something that the world really needs to learn from in order to manage the current and future crises.
And if I could comment on a couple of things,
Sure.
You guys have made some really great comments. I think the idea of this being a new normal sounds right to me. And the old normal sucked, and now the new normal, I don't know how it's going to be, but I think a lot of it has to do with to make the best of it, really organizing and federal regulations. And we can't expect the rich and the powerful to do the right thing, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have federal regulations. We'd still have 10-year-old kids working in factories if we didn't have child labor laws and all the. As much as people like to complain about federal regulations, they're the only reason I'm probably still alive, is that I have had some minimal amount of physical therapy, and just since I was poor and no family when I was injured, it's saved countless lives. And I think that we need to make the best of the new normal. And it's a really good point.
That was well said. That was very well said. Anybody want to add to that? All right. Yeah, I agree with you. Making the best of the new norm is probably more healthier than what we maybe anticipate at this point. Again, as I was reading the infrastructure bill, everything points to something new. They want to evolve into electric vehicles and evolve into this new thing, and we have to make progress. You know what I mean? We always want to throw it off at recession, you know, or something going back. If we want to throw it going back, we have to learn different ways to go forward and essentially move forward with one another. But yeah, man, this was a healthy discussion, and I'm so happy we got some good participation tonight. You know, some of the takeaways just for, you know, those who are going to be viewing this, that, you know, in terms of preparing for like a disaster, you know, you may want to buy in bulk right now. Not that it's going to solve everything, but at least you have something in your storehouse. I think the number of people in your household matters in terms of how you manage and ration out, you know, the different, you know, your meals and water. Again, you know, they're down in Jackson, Mississippi, and they can't even boil water because the sediment is still there. So, you know, the number of people in your household matters. Survival probability based on disability and your potential quality of life is not a basis for who goes first and who goes last. It's just about organizing and managing and being selfless, I think, in the moment. Equal footing is equity for all, and we need to understand that some of the things we can learn in this new normal is that the long haul symptoms, whether you have had COVID or not, they aren't quite quantified yet. And we just have to understand that those who are in charge, government officials, local officials, are trying to do their best to figure it out. So we got to kind of give them a break at the end of the day, and the organization is key. But above all else, anxiety arose, but resilience rose above all of that. So again, guys, thank you so much for participating in our More Than Walking video podcast discussion. Please stay tuned and join us next month and sign up for the More Than Walking newsletter at morethanwalking.com to learn about the topic we will cover next. Until next time, remain encouraged, stay hopeful, and above all else, be aware. Take care, everyone, and have a blessed night.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Corey.
Thanks
Thank you,
for all the
guys.
comments.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good one.